I'm moderating the morning sessions, and it's going to be very fast-paced. We've got a lot to cover. We will likely be touching on the following subject matter at a minimum: novel therapeutics, biosimilars, immuno-oncology, companion diagnostics, precision medicine, and how all may impact cost and reimbursement, and how physicians will maintain competency as they quickly move from a period, an era, in which 10 drugs managed 100 different cancers to an era in which 100 drugs manage 10 cancers. So, a tremendous amount to cover this morning. We're starting with a panel discussion. On the panel, we'll go from far to near. We have Yusuf Zafar, MD, MHS, is a gastrointestinal medical oncologist and healthcare delivery researcher, associate professor of medicine at Duke. Next to him, Daniel Klein. Daniel is the president and chief executive officer at the Patient Access Network Foundation. Then we have Peter Bach. Needs no introduction. You've seen him on TV, you've heard him on the radio. No, Peter's here. Peter has had a lot of recent media attention for his work with drug abacus, but he is a Memorial Sloan Kettering physician. And then last, John Fox, also a physician. John is senior medical director and vice president of medical affairs for Priority Health. So welcome them. Not like this, we welcome them. All right, so we're going to start off the session, and I'm going to look for all of you to kind of also participate. I think there's a lot of questions you may have with this topic. And so I think I might want to direct it to Peter to start with, just because there are a lot of folks in this audience who probably are of the belief that market forces and competition are likely going to be drivers of change in the marketplace, and particularly around the area of cost. And they would likely give you examples, and they would give you an example like hepatitis C, where we saw after the initial year, there was significant movement by the PBMs, and prices could have reduced by as much as 50%. The pressure that's taking place right now against some of the repriced generics. And so you have taken positions that that's not enough, and as a reason, one of the ways in which you've kind of walk the walk and not just talk the talk is in the development of the drug abacus. So I'd like you to be able to respond to that and why you think that there is stakeholder dissatisfaction with the pace of change and why other things are going to be needed.
Great, well thanks and good morning, and thank you for the non-introduction introduction. I come from a market-oriented background, and I also, for some period of time, believed that we could get the market to function well for example, drugs or the provision of services or hospitals. But it doesn't seem to be working out that way, and I will talk about the Hep C example, but just in general, we have sort of too few purchasers and too few providers in many areas of healthcare, and so we see these push-pulls that are clearing the market at prices, and in many cases that are undesirable, or we see intermediaries capturing huge amounts of money as they play some role clearing the market. So if you think about the cost of hospital care or something like that, it's substantially higher here per day than it is in any other European country, and that's not driven by, for example, pharmaceutical price gouging or something like that. Drugs play a very small role in the hospital, but just hospitals have unbelievable market power. And so they're able to extract much higher rates. They also have different cost structures, but much higher rates than they are, for example, in a government price setting scenario, such as in Germany. So again, this tension of, yes, there's a market, we get to a price, but is it the right price, is the most efficient price? Usually not. So on the issue of drugs, you could take the view that if we just had competition between similar products and we could clear the market based on, I'm only going to buy you or I'm only going to buy you could really get price movement, right? And that's kind of what we saw with Hep C, right? So we get Sovaldi, then AbbVie comes out with Viekira Pak, Express Scripts, the nation's largest PBM, really puffs its chest and says, Gilead, you're out, exclusive with AbbVie. And got a price concession that we can't see into exactly, but we can get a sense of what Gilead's counter discount was, which is probably about 30% off of list, right? But it required each of those PBMs, CVS Caremark on the other side, to exclude the other product. So when I look at oncology, I think, is that the most efficient thing to do, to be forced to say, we'll take this drug, not that other drug. Is that best for patients? Is that best for innovation? Is that even what innovators want to get to a reasonable price? And I think we're going to run out of examples where there's true substitutability long before we run out of products that we want to get to appropriate prices. And you know, you brought up Hep C, and I had already written it down when you started saying this thing about competition, because it is the unique example everybody marches out, right? So if you look at Gleevec's price, as competitors to Gleevec entered the market, Gleevec's price continued to go up. And in fact, oncology prices for orals, if a competitor enters the market, their inflation rate's about 5% per year. When they get a competitor, there's a one-time 2% reduction in that growth rate. So competition is not working to affect drug prices. So the idea of the drug advocates, sort of writ large, is let's clear the market based on prices that make sense for what consumers or patients want. If drugs work well, they should cost more money than if drugs work poorly. And the drug advocates was essentially a proof of concept that we could do this. We could take the attributes of drugs, run them through a formula, essentially. Users can manipulate the formula, and out the other end comes the appropriate price, or the value-based price, and ICER's doing similar things. And the last thing about Hep C, you can say the market worked because prices fell below list, or you could say the market's completely broken because the price of Sovaldi in Pharmasset's filings was $36,000 before Gilead bought the drug, finished a phase 3 Pharmasset had already budgeted for, and then tacked an $84,000 price on it. The VA is now paying $49,000, and that's a cheap system for Sovaldi. So to me, it's 50% more than it would have been had Gilead not bought it, not 40% less than the price.
All right, so John, given that you're going to represent the payers in your role on the panel, now you've got Peter's efforts at a drug advocates. We heard from Julie Vose last night, ASCO's value framework. We now have NCCN weighing in with their evidence blocks. We've only seen it for 2 diseases, but we get a sense of where it's going to be. We've got ESMO that should release within the year. We've got ICER with a $5.2 million grant to develop a similar. Do payers see any role for this, do you think, in the way that they're going to incorporate or this information? I mean, clearly payers have embraced things like NCCN guidelines and helped to guide medical policy. Do payers start to embrace these kinds of tools to guide policy and benefit design?
I often say that I'm subject to 2 courts, the court of law and the court of public opinion. And it's not clear to me that even if I wanted to use those tools and I thought that there was a legitimate distinction between different products, that I could use those and choose preferred products based on that data because of the court of law and the court of public opinion. I think probably the more realistic possibility is not to focus on contracting directly with manufacturers around price, but contracting with manufacturers around outcomes. We pay a lot of dollars in the healthcare system for drugs that aren't appropriate for a patient or don't work as they're predicted in the clinical trials. And I think in the future, we're interested in long-term relationships with manufacturers that are focused on paying for outcomes rather than paying whatever price they demand.
So Dan, as someone who is focused on the patient access piece of this, and I got to tell you, just as an aside, as we're now focusing on this year, maybe at the moment in patient-centered medicine, listening to Julie Vose's presentation last night, I was thinking about, do we need a movement for physician-centered medicine where we once again respect the physician and his time? But that's an aside for another, I just had to throw that out there. But I want to get this idea, related to the patient access piece and how we want patients to share in the decision-making. There's always been this question, are they capable of sharing in the decision-making? Do they understand the nuance that is related? Is that putting too much of a burden on them if we're giving them access to this information without more training, education? And I'm curious how, from a patient access perspective, how you see this evolving area.
Sure, I think that the concern we have is that regardless of where drug prices fall out and whether they rationalize, we still have patients, particularly those with serious illnesses or chronic diseases, people between 200% and 400% of federal poverty level, who under even reasonable drug pricing would probably be kept out of the market, kept out of access to drugs like Sovaldi or Harvoni, even at a price of $49,000 like the VA is paying. So when you look at, for example, Medicare Part D, someone would be paying almost $7,000 out of pocket to get access to those drugs, even at a more rational price. So the problem is that the effort that's been made to keep healthcare premiums low resulted in a lot more shifting of costs to deductibles and coinsurance. And there's a part of the community that is going to be unable to access products even when drugs are priced reasonably, and many are. So I think that the question becomes, what kind of safety net do we want? And PAN plays a role today that no one else fills, which is to ensure that people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access drugs can do so. And the other piece of this is, are there substitutes available? Because you're asking sort of the question that the Rand Health Insurance study was asking. If you put some kind of price in front of the consumer to help make them think about the cost of what they're using, will they make a rational decision? And in many cases, in oncology or in hepatitis care, there really aren't substitutes of that kind available. So it's not a fair question to ask. So our focus is basically on making sure that people don't have a barrier that's going to prevent them from using a treatment that is the recommended treatment.
Sorry, technical. Technical. So, Yusuf, some could argue that in your work in healthcare disparities that there are systemic flaws in the system that require Dan to have a foundation to be a safety net. What do you see in your work that, I know this is kind of weird, guys, but, so what do you see in your work that, thank you. Or how would you see from a design, a system design difference? How would you see things maybe as they could be or should be, rather than how the pieces are falling together now?
So, as an oncologist who's interested in value, I am stuck in a really interesting position because I sort of have to think about what's happening to our health system, what's happening to the cost of drugs and prices of our interventions from a broad level. And then I go into the room in clinic and I sit next to a patient and I prescribe those same expensive drugs, knowing that we're going to get marginal benefit from them. And so I had a lot of hair before I started, this field of research. And then I realized every decision I was making in clinic was contrary to what I was talking about in settings like this. And that's exactly where we've got these problems in our health system. So the way I've sort of reconciled it is to think about two conversations, and I really do think that we have to keep these separate. So the first is to think about value to society, to think about how we can make changes to reimbursement, how we can make changes to coverage. I love the idea of performance-based coverage and targeted value-based insurance plans. And that's one discussion. But the second is the discussion that I have with my patient in clinic every day. And I have got to sort of put a little bit of that out of my mind as I talk to my patient and describe to her what I think the best treatment is. Where I start thinking about cost there is the cost to the patient. So again, the two discussions are cost to society versus cost to patient. And I think where physicians start having some discomfort, where I hear a lot of physicians saying is that, it's not our job to talk about cost, and it's not our job to talk about value, and we weren't trained to do that. That's absolutely true. But it is definitely our job to protect our patients from harm resulting from treatment, both physical and financial. And so, because of these holes in our system, Dan is Dan has a foundation to cover patient costs, and I'm stuck having a conversation with patients about how much a particular treatment may cost them, and whether it's worth months worth of improvement in survival to pay potentially thousands of dollars.
All right, so perfect segue. This is all by means of introduction to the topic title, which was who pays. But I felt we needed to kind of level set, and we're going to have more time in the next panel to kind of continue to explore the subject. But it does get that question, right? So as a practicing oncologist, you're confronted with, do I really want to be talking about cost? And I want to spend all my time talking about the treatment and the why and behind it, and now I'm spending more of my time on the financial toxicity than I am on the traditional A&Es that might happen with the treatment and the efficacy story. And so it does get into that question of, for the patient perspective, only if really they have significant burden of cost. And if they don't have any burden of cost, you could argue, well, no reason to have a conversation with you, it's not going to be a factor. But John, I guess from the payer perspective, how do we start to get more patient involvement and patient co-responsibility for the financial when the burden is just so high, it's not really reasonable? You set that copay, that deductible, whatever the co-insurance, but how far can you go? $150,000 therapy, can you go 1%? How far can you take that to be meaningful? And if it's not meaningful, then it's just the burden falls on you as the insurer.
Yeah. Well, the reality is that under the Accountable Care Act, there is a maximum out of pocket for combined medical and pharmacy benefits, which for an individual is like $6,350, and for a family is $13,000. Still a significant amount of money, but that's the cost of 1 month's worth of therapy. I think that we're having the wrong discussion, though, is how do we alleviate the cost to the patient. I think the discussion is how do we right-size the cost of these therapies. And I think what's interesting, as the Medicare CMMI oncology care model takes off next year, what decision will physicians make about what therapies they're going to use when they have some risk or some skin in the game for the cost of the drug? Will they make those decisions? Will USEF make a decision to use a drug that is less costly because it's not only to the benefit of the patient, but to the benefit of the healthcare system? So I think as I reflect on my position as a payer, I don't have a lot of market power to influence the cost of drugs, but physicians certainly have a lot of influence over what drugs are going to choose based on the cost and efficacy. And I think Memorial Sloan Kettering showed that with aflibercept.
All right, so I want, again, maybe any of you to weigh in, but I'll start with Peter on this, to respond to John, and that is, isn't there as much of a perverse incentive if physicians are being incentivized to withhold therapy as there is to prescribe therapy in the current buy and bill system? And how do we resolve that potential that, we're moving frying pan to fire, by having a system of that design?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a lot of people have worried about it, including me, that if you reverse the incentives, you'll get the reverse behavior, right? So we have a lot of evidence that when the margins are larger for drugs, doctors will tilt towards prescribing them. We have a couple of government reports now showing that the 340B hospitals, when they shifted to 340B, started prescribing more expensive drugs, or the docs through the outpatient setting use more expensive drugs. So we know these incentives work, which is a potential problem. So most people would say, and I'm somewhat comfortable saying this, that the bridge is more quality, more pathways, more guidelines, more just sort of ways of reconciling what's happening within that box to make sure that at least it's up to standards. But two things, right? One is John's absolutely right about what the Affordable Care Act says on the commercial insurance side. There is no out-of-pocket max on either Part B like boy or D like dog in Medicare for drugs. So you can spend, even in the catastrophic, when you're spending 5% of a drug that's $100,000, the median income in Medicare is $24,000 for a year before taxes. So, that even that little 5% that when we were implementing, we're like, oh, it's 5%, no big deal. 5% of a huge number is still a huge number. And the co-insurance on B has no out-of-pocket max, and it's 20%. About 15% patients are naked on that. They're exactly the group Dan is talking about. They're above poverty, but they tend to be below the average because the people above that are usually wrapped by either their own product or an employer-sponsored product. But in this, I want one technical issue. If we think about this oncology care model going forward, there's no question if we continue at the current trend that there's both going to be new therapies and new stacking of old therapies or old with new the price profile of spend in oncology is going to change very rapidly, and it'll go up. That's the prediction, at least. And how they'll do the projections for the gain share in that model will be a critical issue. And so this is, again, a technical point, but they are trying to figure out how much you should spend when the environment is changing very rapidly and there's price inflation. So the exact technical way that Medicare incorporates, for example, now we can stack two IOs. How do I project how much they should spend so I can figure out if they're saving money or overspending? That's going to become a real crucible for this entire issue about bundling.
All right, so I want Dan and Yusuf there to weigh in, but before they do, if you've got questions, raise your hand. We'll get mics into some hands. Take advantage of who you've got up here and press them on the issues. So while the mics are being passed around, raise your hands if you've got questions. Dan, Yusuf, I want you to weigh in on this.
Sure. I think the question that we have and that we're always asked is, to what degree does charitable assistance, does patient assistance disintermediate the patient to such a degree that they have no involvement in the decision-making around what therapies they use. And the issue, I think that it's sort of a false issue in that the deductibles and copays have become so high that it's really not even a question of moral hazard anymore. It's not a question of whether or not the patient is being influenced to become involved in the decision-making process. The deductibles and coinsurance are so high that they're not even able to get into the game. So even if they were knowledgeable, and that's always been a question, whether the patients are knowledgeable enough to make decisions about which therapy to choose. At this point, when you have a patient at 200% of federal poverty levels, let's say in Medicare Part D, household of two, that's about $30,000 a year. So with the Hep C example, they're paying over 15% of their household income just to get through the donut hole and to pay that catastrophic 5%. So I don't think it's even an issue of moral hazard at that point. It's completely stopping them out of the market, so they won't have access. So PAN Foundation, basically is providing the ability for them to get access to drugs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access, recognizing the fact that it's not a perfect solution. And I think that's what we all have to understand, that it's a perhaps short-term solution if the market rationalizes, but right now it's the only solution available. So the taxpayer is not going to step in and offset these high out-of-pocket costs by removing the deductibles and copays. And recognizing that, you're left with organizations like PAN, at least for the time being.
Go for it, guys. Fight it out.
Yeah, no, just to echo that point. I mean, the reason we have cost shifting is two, right? One is to get it off the books and the insurers so it's not spread across premiums. That definitely works. But the other issue is this sort of soft economic nudge. And I remember years ago explaining copays to my wife, and she's saying $5,000 copay on somebody who's got a $12,000 a year income. That's like I got in the mail today this thing that says the new Ferraris are in. Come in today and buy one and you get $10 off. It's just this thing is completely out of whack, right? So it is not a soft incentive to say spend the next 2 years of your disposable income on a drug for a cure for something that isn't causing you any symptoms.
But for Yusuf, I guess the question is, with these perverse incentives not to provide therapy, I'm not sure that there's not a tremendous amount of money to be saved because, as you said, we're treating patients who are likely to derive marginal benefit. Do you think putting physicians at risk for the cost of therapies is going to make them take advantage of new opportunities to thaw on this discussions about death panels and the ability to do advanced care planning? Will more of those discussions occur to help truly inform patients about the likelihood of benefit?
Yeah, so I think, I completely agree with Peter. I think the incentives and disincentives are working right now. I mean, I see it every day where, the vast majority, I'm an academic center, the vast majority of community oncologists I work with are treating patients the way that they think the patients should be treated. Occasionally I will see patients sent in to me with a note saying, I really want to give him this, but I can't. I can't give him this drug because my practice can't afford it. It's not going to get reimbursed. But you can do it at Duke because Duke's just going to cover it. And I do. If I think it's the right regimen for the patient. So I think already we're seeing those sort of disincentives, but the problem is those aren't actually based on the value of the regimen in many cases. What we're seeing in Europe, for example, is that certain regimens, some of them are actually developed in Europe, aren't even covered there at all because there's just no benefit to it. So if someone at a higher pay grade than the physician was saying, this is just not going to get covered across the board. And I can think of, examples in pancreatic cancer where you're going into the third line of therapy, again, for sometimes weeks of benefit. As an oncologist, sometimes we may provide that treatment to a patient because it is something we can do. But when we're forced to have that discussion with the patient of, you might get a few weeks of benefit for this, but at the same time, your family might end up with $10,000 in debt. I've had that discussion with patients, and I've had patients say, no, thank you. So yeah, absolutely. I think that would change practice.
All right, I'm going to have you hold there. We've got a question, at least one in the audience, so let's take that.
Thank you, and great panel, different perspectives. This is McCrae from Janssen. My question to you is, from each of the panel members, I would love to hear some solutions and suggestions around inefficiencies in the healthcare system beyond drug costs, whether that's inefficiencies as a result of site of care or inefficient care standardization you referred to leading to hospitalization ER visits that are avoidable, or any other thoughts that you have around reducing healthcare costs beyond the product costs.
Yeah, well, I would say that the first inefficiency isn't really an inefficiency, it's a harm. Jennifer Temmel published 3 years ago the study of non-small cell lung cancer showing the benefit of palliative care, adding 3 months of additional life. If that had been a drug, everybody in the country would be on that. But now, very few people get palliative care. And it's unfortunate because I think we cause a lot of harm to patients by providing cancer chemotherapy or immunotherapy that has very marginal benefit when alternatives that cost less and are more likely to meet a patient's personal preferences and goals and priorities aren't provided. So I think if we were more focused on patient-centered care, as we talked about last night, and understanding what the patient's personal goals are and preferences, what the family's goals are, I think we could drive out a lot of waste by eliminating care that patients wouldn't have wanted had they known all the options.
Yeah, no, and I'd be happy to talk about, but I do think talking about drug pricing is worthwhile. We spend $400 billion a year this year on drug pricing. It's more than $1,100 per American. It's the only sector of healthcare where the manufacturer sets their own price. And actually, if you look at access issues for oncology, it's really about drugs. So if we can return to that point or topic for a second, let me paint a picture for you. It is the case that drugs have high prices and insurers attach high co-insurance, and that causes barriers to care. But it's also that the prices are product of markets. And you brought up the Zaltrap example, and that will never happen again, I don't believe. I don't think a company will ever lower their price due to an op-ed again. But what it demonstrated more, what's thematic, is that the prices are products of markets. And so if insurers instead created proper incentives for pharmaceutical companies to come in at value-based prices, I think we could clear this market much more efficiently. And I think the way to think about this is, if you have drugs that have value-based prices linked to their benefits, they should be first tier, they should have a $2 copay, they should be available to patients. And in Yusuf's example, and I think I know which drug he's talking about, but if there's a third-line pancreatic drug that gives a few weeks of life with low toxicity, there's a price that's appropriate for us to pay collectively for that. And I don't know if it's $1, it's certainly more than that. I know it's less than $100,000, but we should be able to find that price, and then patients should be able to have access to it at that price. And so we should be thinking about this as a dynamic pricing environment where the way insurers handle the drugs will dictate what the prices are, and that could be through tiering, could be through selective 340B discounts only for those drugs that are overpriced relative to a value framework, but they should be first tier if they're appropriate. Yeah. Drugs like Gleevec are probably not grossly mispriced, yet patients aren't able to get them because of high copay.
All right, so I'm gonna hold it there, not because Peter always gets the last word, but because we're out of time. So, my thanks to the panel. I know that the next speakers would love for this panel to go on all morning, but no, they have to work too. So, thanks to the panel. And gentlemen, my thanks.